Welcome to the Be All You Can Be MSC, a podcast dedicated to empowering Army Medical Service Corps officers and professionals like you. I'm your host, Stephanie Moore. Now, on today's episode of the Be All You Can Be MSC podcast, we have a special guest who I met almost 9 years ago when I was stationed at Fort Cavazos, and I actually met her before she even started her Army journey. But even then, she was the example of servant leadership. She really owned giving back to our Army community and family. I take great pleasure in welcoming Captain Jamie Webb. So, Jamie, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Colonel Moore, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
So I alluded to that we met before you even became an Army officer, but would you share a little bit about your experience coming into the Army and what you've been doing as a 73 Alpha social worker?
Sure. So I feel like the journey that brought me to the military is a little longer than my actual military service at this point. So let me go back in time and explain what brought me here. So I've been married to the military for about almost 20 years now. I'm surprised to even say that out loud, but it's been almost 20 years. I have been married to my soldier through 4 combat deployments as a spouse, and we have raised 3 children in the military, one of whom is now a college student. And so I've had the unique perspective of working with the military as a spouse and having the spouse's perspective, but also as a volunteer in my personal service to the military, and then also professionally. And so even before I commissioned, I tended to gravitate toward positions professionally that were affiliated with the military or served the military community because that's where my heart was. In a personal sense, I worked very closely with at the time, Family Readiness Group, or what we now call the Soldier and Family Readiness Group, or SF. With 1st Medical Brigade, my husband was stationed with 1st Med for 9 years. And so for about 8 of those 9 years, I volunteered very extensively with that unit, and I loved every moment of it. So that was in addition to my actual job, which varied over time, but was typically with the Department of Behavioral Health at the Darnall Army Medical Center. I can go into a little bit of detail if you'd like about some of the experiences that I had personally and or professionally, or the types of professional experience that I had leading up to my military commissioning. Let me know which direction you'd like me to go with that.
So absolutely, because I think it's important to really highlight why the interest in social work and what got you to go from being an Army wife to an Army officer. So I'd love if you could delve a little deeper.
Sure. So, I guess it starts back in 2005, 2006. My husband was deployed at the time to Iraq. And that was a very difficult deployment for his unit. He was with the 172nd Stryker Brigade combat team out of Fort Wainwright, Alaska. And during that deployment, there were quite a few casualties that had taken place, and it really impacted both my husband and the soldiers he served with. And so that, I think, is the time where I developed an interest in behavioral health and how the current conflict that our soldiers were serving in impacted them psychologically. And so during that deployment, I had an infant child and decided to start going to school online for my associate's degree in psychology. And so I started doing my education at that time. We PCS to Fort Irwin and then to Fort Hood at the time, or now Cavazos. And as I was working on my bachelor's in psychology, I got my first clinical position at Fort Hood's former urgent care and triage clinic, which before we had embedded behavioral health clinics or EBHs, we had one outpatient clinic on the installation for the entire installation and one walk-in clinic, which was our urgent care and triage clinic. So any service member who may be experiencing a crisis or who may be having a really difficult time and needed to be linked to care would walk into the urgent care and triage clinic, and we would do a triage assessment with them and connect them to resources. So that was my first clinical position back in 2009, 2010. After that, I worked in a few different psychiatric inpatient settings. I worked both on the clinical side with the patients directly and then also as a liaison for one of our psychiatric hospitals local to Fort Cavazos. I was a military liaison, and so I would work very closely with the installations to understand what gaps and resources they had for their different patient populations on the installation. And then I would work with the hospital to develop programming to fill those gaps and then market those programs to Fort Cavazos in order to get patients to come on over. So that was a unique experience. I did miss the clinical side of things when I was doing the liaison and marketing position. And so I was offered an opportunity to work with the Strong Star PTSD Research Consortium, which is the world's largest and most funded PTSD research consortium. And that was an incredible experience that I had for 5.5 years. So in that position, I coordinated 3 different research studies, and they looked at various aspects of not only post-traumatic stress in our service members, but also things like insomnia and sleep disturbance, looking at things like stress biomarkers, pre and post PTSD treatment, looking at neurology, so looking at fMRI images pre and post treatment to see how the brain changes with post-traumatic stress treatment in those who have been diagnosed with PTSD. And so that was just really a profoundly incredible experience where I feel I really grew and my passion for helping soldiers, especially in the behavioral health population, truly developed. At one point, and this is my final thing that I did right before I commissioned, I also was offered a position with the New York University Family Translational Research Group, or FTRG. And I was stationed at Fort Cavazos, and I was working out of the Department of Behavioral Health and specifically the Family Advocacy Program, or FAP. But I was coordinating a study for New York University and helping FAP to transition their abuse, neglect, and maltreatment substantiation system from the former Case Review Committee to what is now the Incident Determination Committee. So that was a really great experience as well. And I left that position to join the military. So that's a little bit about some of my past professional experience. But while I was doing all of those things, I was also very heavily involved, like I said, in the old family readiness group system. And I loved that because I always, especially with 1st Med Brigade, I was always provided opportunities by the leaders who worked within that brigade at various levels within the organization to develop and create creative ways to bring people in and create inclusivity, to increase morale, to increase trust within the organization, to include family members in what the unit had going on operationally. And that was just I can't even speak highly enough about the experience that I had doing those things.
No, and I will tell you that what I definitely saw, you made a huge impact to our soldiers when I was in 1st Med Brigade, and that really stood out about you. And I really appreciate you sharing how your journey has progressed, because it also explains where you were coming from, because not only do you see what our service members have gone through and some of their challenges that they have, but you also always, and I don't know, and I know it goes beyond you just being a military spouse, also always focused on what is that family going through? What are those children going through? And the fact that you advocated for them from almost a 360-degree purview, I mean, is really speaks volumes to you as a leader. So just know that it definitely made an impact and is one of the main reasons why I reached out to you to see if you would share your Army journey with us as well.
Yeah, sure. And I really appreciate you reaching out. Looking back, I find that I tap into that past experience quite a bit when I talk with many of my colleagues about the perspective of the family, because when it comes to things like rotations or deployments, for example, I have never known a lonelier or more quiet time in my life than the moment you walk into your home and close the door after sending your soldier off to a war or to a long rotation. And that's just something that I think that as a soldier, your perspective is very different. You are on a bus and then you're on a plane and then you have this mission that you are focused on. But for the family member, there's just this glaring absence that you're faced with. And so I'm very grateful for some of the adversities that I have had the opportunity and privilege to live through in the past, because it's helped to mold the perspective I have today.
No, absolutely. So thanks for sharing that. And so I'd be curious, so like how did you go about becoming commissioned and also becoming a social worker? What avenue did you take?
So I learned about the Army's Masters in Social Work program, which at the time when I first learned about it was through Fayetteville University back in, I want to say 2009 or 10. They were just starting that program out, and I was incredibly interested in it. However, I had a young daughter at the time and was trying to navigate how could this program be something that I could benefit from while also supporting my active duty spouse and holding down a home and raising a child. So it took me quite a few years to get there, but I did eventually apply to that program in 2017. I added two more children between learning about the program and actually applying to it, but I did apply and I was selected. So I commissioned in July of 2018. And at that time, the program, the Masters in Social Work program through the Medical Center of Excellence, had changed from a Fayetteville State University program to a University of Kentucky program. So I believe I was the second cohort to go through under the University of Kentucky program.
And so that program, correct me if I'm wrong, because I did some research ahead of time because I wasn't quite sure all the options for you, but is a 14-month course?
Yes, so there's two phases. Phase one, or the didactic phase, as I've always called it, is a 14-month course where if you are a direct accession like me, just someone off the street, you would go to the AMEDD direct commissioning course at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And then you would go to BOLIC following your direct commissioning course. BOLIC is at Fort Sam Houston, or JBSA. And so following those two commissioning sources, you would then go to the program itself. Phase one, or the didactic program, we call them mini mesters, or 7-week semesters, where you take 4 classes in that 7-week period, which was a new experience for me, and it was manageable, but it was a lot. You start a class and 3 weeks later you're taking a midterm, and then 4 weeks later you're taking a final exam in 4 different classes. But it kept you on your toes, and it kept you really, I think, sharp in terms of having to be present in those classes and hearing the content and synthesizing that content and being able to implement what you're learning. After 2 7-week mini mesters, there's a field placement. So you're given an opportunity to go out into the wild and to practice the skills that you've learned. My field placement in the MSW program, I had 2 field placements, as everyone does, but my first one was with a hospice agency. And that was an experience that I am so incredibly grateful that I had the chance to experience. We came back from that 15-week field placement and then did another 2 7-week blocks of mini mesters and then a final field placement. And so that's that 14-month phase one didactic phase of the program. Following that, there's a 26-month internship that we do at one of 10 different sites. And so Fort Cavazos was where I requested, because that was where my family was located, and I was selected for that location. And so in the phase two, we call it the social work internship program, or SWIP. Interns are provided the opportunity to engage in a variety of different clinical positions. Some of those are mandatory, and then some of them are elective. And so, for example, I chose 2 different elective rotations to include a psychological health intensive outpatient program, which is a daily treatment program for 30 days for service members who need something more intensive than an outpatient treatment program, but something less intensive than like a psychiatric inpatient hospitalization. And then I also worked at the Darnall Hospital emergency department during COVID. And so we would do crisis evaluations for individuals who were coming in with psychiatric conditions, or who may be coming in with suicidal ideations or homicidal ideations, or who may have attempted suicide. And so that was a unique experience as well. Some of the mandatory rotations would include like family advocacy, which is where you're working with the abuse, neglect, and maltreatment of service members or family members. We also have a substance abuse clinical care, a substance use disorder clinical care rotation, and an embedded behavioral health or EBH rotation. And that one is our longest, which is about a year long.
Well, it definitely sounds like a very in-depth program. I like the aspects that you're able to choose some routes that you want to go. So I would be curious with the hospice care. I know that was a very unique rotation that you got to be a part of. What one thing stood out about that rotation, like that you felt like this was like a great thing that I gained by doing this?
I requested that rotation or that field placement because I wasn't very comfortable with death or elderly people, if I'm honest. I didn't grow up around my grandparents. I wasn't sure how to connect with the elderly population, and I viewed them as fragile and those who were experiencing Alzheimer's or dementia. How do you interact with individuals with these various kind of unique circumstances? And so I requested that field placement because I wanted to get more comfortable with death as I was going to be working with an active duty population. And we may be experiencing situations where death is a part of sometimes war or suicide and things like that. So, how do I help individuals who are going through that themselves or have someone they love who has passed? And how do I help them with that grieving process? So, it's hard to choose just one thing, but I had during that 15-week rotation, I did lose multiple patients of mine who were in hospice for that reason. They weren't anticipated to live beyond 6 months. And my first patient died 2 days into my rotation. So I was with that individual when she passed, and I was the only one in the room with her. And I was very quickly faced with a lot of what I feared the most, which was what do you do in the immediate aftermath of someone passing, or how do you help them when the inevitable is that they will pass? And what I learned from that rotation is just that death is a natural part of life, and it can actually be an incredibly beautiful, peaceful moment where you can be that comfort in the room for that person who is making that transition to whatever lies beyond life.
No, I really appreciate you sharing that, Jamie, having been with several, including family members when they've passed. I definitely agree. And I think that's very admirable of you that you took your fear and decided to face it, knowing your role in the Army is going to be to really be able to provide that comfort as our service members, unfortunately, will have to face that at some point in their career. So thank you for sharing a little bit more of that side. And then you highlighted something too, I think is really important here in the rotation you did during your SWIP on the emergency department with the crisis evaluation. So that resonates with me because I've found myself in my career faced with a situation with someone that had openly admitted that they were suicidal and more than just a passing note. And I did convince that individual to go with me to the emergency room to a military treatment facility. And it was incredible how that crisis evaluation is done. And I will tell you, oftentimes I've heard in my career where people say, oh, well, they don't take it serious. But in this instance, it was taken very serious. The evaluation process was very thorough. And then ultimately, this person did become an inpatient and get the help that they needed. But I think a lot of people don't know about that crisis evaluation. And I think a lot of leaders don't realize that there's value added to you as the leader going with that individual to the emergency room.
Absolutely. First of all, we should never leave a soldier who's expressing some form of suicidal ideation alone. We just should never leave them alone. Even we've had situations where we have had escorts bringing someone to the hospital, and the soldier who's having the suicidal ideation will ask, well, can I stop by my barracks room or my home and pick up a few things? And so the escort will sometimes wait outside, and there have been fatalities during that time because they were left alone. It's incredibly important to physically bring that person in and to show them that not only are you doing it as a leader because you should, but you're doing it because you have vested interest in that person and you want to see them be okay. Like there's a genuine care and concern that can come along with that. And so I think that we sense those things as human beings. And if we can communicate that through our actions as leaders, that's one of the most important things that we can do for someone who is experiencing that level of isolation or devastation or solitude or whatever it is that they may be experiencing at that moment.
Absolutely. So I know we've talked around it, but we've talked about the loss that ultimately does occur in the military if you serve long enough, and then the struggle with some of the mental health and behavioral health aspects out there. But the social workers have a huge role in my mind out there. So I'd like to delve a little bit deeper in what is the social worker's role in the operational units? Because like when I was in 3rd Cavalry Regiment, we had a social worker embedded with us and was a big part of the team. But I'd like you to really go and highlight why are they in the operational units and what else do they bring to the table other than when things get tough? Because that's not the only time that the social worker is critical.
Definitely. I love that you even just said that because one of my senior leaders at my current organization recently said that it was so important that leaders don't just have that negative association between the social worker and like a negative event or a poor outcome, like to know the social worker and to see what they bring to the table, even when there isn't tragedy lurking around the corner, is incredibly important. So, what social workers do, it's a lot. If I were to have to summarize, I think the Army answer is that we were supposed to spend about half of our time doing clinical work, and that looks like a variety of different things. I can touch on that a little bit. So, half of our time should be spent in a clinic weekly, and then half of our time should be spent with our force comm units doing things like battlefield circulation and prevention activities, going to meetings and talking about medical readiness and how to improve medical readiness to address things like trends that we're seeing in the clinic and how can leaders support the behavioral health team in mitigating some of those issues. In addition, when there is something like a training accident or a suicide or something completely adverse that happens, social workers should be out in those force comm units doing traumatic event management with those soldiers so that we are going to them and not waiting for them to come to us in a clinic.
No, absolutely. So let's highlight a little bit more something that you talked about there. One of them was you can look at the trends from what you're seeing in the clinical aspect, and you can look to how leaders can better support their force. So, can you give me an example?
Sure. So, one of the things that we rolled out this year with my brigade is an existing resource that I think is a little underutilized across the Army called the Behavioral Health Pulse Survey. It's it used to be called a unit needs assessment, but it's evolved over time. And so, what the Behavioral Health Pulse Survey does is it allows us to interact with our formations in a way that allows soldiers to complete an anonymous survey on their personal devices by just scanning a QR code and inputting a unique PIN that is associated with their company or troop organization. And they fill out a 15 to 20-minute survey all about different behavioral health related aspects. So things like depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress symptoms. How are they sleeping? What risk behaviors are they engaging in? How do they feel morale and cohesion is among their teams? How are they feeling like they're doing in terms of connectedness with other people? And we can take the data that's aggregated from that survey to further address trends and patterns that our soldiers themselves are reporting that we may not ever see within a clinical setting because some of these individuals may not come to see us or report those things. So that is an incredible tool that I would highly recommend that our behavioral health community engage with, and it's super easy to use. The investment that you put into that time-wise in the beginning pays dividends long term.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that because this is actually the first I've heard of that survey. Now, mind you, I have been away from the operational force for quite a few years, but I would guess that isn't something just operational units could benefit from. Even I'm assuming that TDA medical treatment facilities can take advantage of that type of survey.
I believe so. The individuals I've interacted with who work on the behavioral health pulse surveys have been incredibly open to different ways to utilize the survey. Ultimately, the data that's gathered from those surveys belongs to commanders. And so you would have to look at, would it belong to the MTF commander, or how would that work? But I believe that they would be happy to engage in a conversation about how to implement those surveys across different populations to help guide us in our approach to prevention and classes and meeting the needs of our community.
Yeah, I can imagine that depending on what the trends or the outcome of that survey is, it can indicate, I'm assuming, things like a higher need for emotional intelligence, perhaps in the leaders, or perhaps maybe that the op tempo is too
Yep,
high and causing
absolutely.
unnecessary stress on the population. So I would also like to see then from your experience, and I know you said you haven't been in the Army that long, but I would argue that you have invaluable depth of experience even prior to the Army. What tips can you offer leaders so we can better support behavioral health? And then also, how can we better support our social workers to make them more effective?
Well, there are quite a few ideas I have in that way. I feel very lucky and very grateful to have an organization that I work for, 36 Engineer Brigade. The relationships that I've developed with my leaders have been monumental in impacting and influencing the kind of support that the behavioral health team can provide to the formation overall. And so I know that my experience is not shared by all of my colleagues in the field. Some of them have leaders who may not truly understand or value what a behavioral health officer can bring to the table in terms of readiness or deployability or lethality and all of the things that are important to those higher echelons of leadership. But I think developing relationships with your behavioral health team, and that's a two-way street, is incredibly important. Behavioral health officers in general, whether they're social workers or psychologists, we have a unique, I don't know how to put this, system, I guess, with which we work. So we serve two masters. We belong to FORCECOM units. And so I am assigned to 36th Engineer Brigade, but I serve DHA or the Defense Health Agency. So I work in a DHA clinic. I'm credentialed through DHA. They have expectations of me as a provider within their field of practice or their scope of services provided. But my unit also has expectations of me as well. And so it's important, I think, for our FORCECOM leadership to recognize that sometimes we have conflicting responsibilities or conflicting expectations that we're having to manage. And ultimately, I rely very heavily on my FORCECOM leadership to provide me top cover when it comes to the medical element, because we have civilian providers who also are incredible at supporting us in our mission, but they belong to DHA. They are the full-time staff that support DHA, whereas the behavioral health officer has two unique missions that they are constantly having to straddle and balance. And so I would say the biggest takeaway would be for our senior leaders to just provide that top cover, be very clear with what their expectations of their behavioral health officers are, but try to also understand the medical side of it and what the medical expectations are from DHA. And then how can we support the behavioral health officer to be successful in both of those missions?
I'm really glad that you brought that up because we're in a time of change right now. And this transition with Defense Health Agency, where our medical treatment facilities are now under the management of the Defense Health Agency, is very different than when it was just under MedCom. And so a lot of the Defense Health Agency policies don't necessarily have synergy always with the operational type policies, is what I would say. I'm not saying people aren't trying to work together, but right now we haven't quite figured out that synergy to make ourselves like streamlined and effective. I think we're still going through the challenges of transition. And it's like when you got a dirt road and you're trying to flatten it out and get it paved, where we're finding some rocks along the way and some bumps. And so I really appreciate you highlighting that, because I think sometimes the operational commanders don't realize, like, oh, I do have a play in this. I do need to advocate for, and I would argue, my medical personnel, not
Mhm.
just the behavioral health team, because I know that our nurses and our doctors are also going through some of that transition and what it creates, I think, in some of our providers and behavioral health team is you feel the friction when there needs to be
Yeah.
more synergy so you can be at your best and most effective for both sides of the house.
Yes, I agree. I think that provider burnout can definitely be an issue when you're the provider who's trying to satiate the needs of both parties. But when those expectations are sometimes unrealistic and not able to be met, that can definitely contribute to that feeling of burnout. And so, how do we support our providers in feeling like they can accomplish the mission and they can accomplish it to a level of quality that our soldiers deserve without completely derailing the morale or kind of squeezing our providers dry, I think is important.
Right, absolutely. So, any other tips you would like to offer leaders in better supporting the behavioral health in their organization?
I think aside from getting to know your behavioral health officers, providing that top cover, and I guess one last thing is just understanding what are their goals, their professional goals as well. I've had, like, I can't speak highly enough about 36th Engineer Brigade, but my raters and senior raters have all taken time to talk with me about my career glide path and what I want that to look like. And they've asked questions about how they could best support me in that. And that has then led to my continued investment in them and the organization as well, because I feel like they invest in me not only as a soldier and as a behavioral health officer, but as a human being. So, very important.
I like how you talked about that investment. So I will share. I was recently talking to someone and I told them that the old adage of coach, teach, mentor needs to be thrown out. My theory is we need to be teaching, mentoring, and coaching. And the reason for that in my mind is we need to focus on that foundational education. And then we need to really mentor, meaning we as the leaders need to invest and show our junior officers that, hey, I think highly of you. You're worth investing in. I'm leaning forward towards you because how can I coach you if I don't even show you that I care about you or want to invest in you?
Right. Yeah, I think it's important. We talk a lot about things like task versus relational oriented leadership in at the People First Center at Fort Cavazos, which is a great organization that I get to do a transformational leadership training for. But we talk about the importance of that relational oriented leadership. It's not just the tasks that need to be accomplished and the mission. Those things are important, but what gets your buy-in from your people is the relationship that you build with them and that investment that you invest into them.
Absolutely. We were talking before I pressed the record button. That investment is going to become more and more critical. Whereas when I joined the Army, I had the 20-year carrot, so I can retire at 20 years, where that carrot is no longer there. Our junior officers are now fully vested at the 5-year mark. So, what is the difference that's going to want them to stay and be our future leaders and build the bench and be those future strategic leaders? And I think the only way that's going to occur, and again, this is my personal opinion, but is that investment that you are advocating for, and that investment that you're sharing that is being done for you. So I appreciate that you share that.
Definitely. People stay for the people, not for the organization.
Perfect. Very well said. I'm gonna have to hashtag that one. All right, so let's have a little fun here. So, what is the best career advice you've ever received or ever given? And it can be before the Army too.
Okay, well, this was actually, I'm sure I've gotten this advice along the way before the Army, but I remember a specific car ride home from JBSA to Fort Hood at the time, where my family was located while I was in the Master's in Social Work program. And I had to, as an assignment, I had to interview a senior social worker and social work officer, and I had to ask them a litany of questions. And I interviewed Colonel Jeffrey Yarvis, who is now retired. He was one of our most senior social work officers in the Army at the time. And he was also stationed at Fort Cavazos. So I knew him both as a civilian before I commissioned and then obviously as a commissioned officer. And he told me during that car ride that I should never say no to an opportunity. It didn't matter if it seemed to have anything to do with my job or not. If you're offered an opportunity by the Army or those around you, take it. And I've really taken that piece of advice to heart. And I think that because of that, I've had just such an incredible Army experience over the last 5 years. And I'll give you a few examples. I was able as an intern to go to the National Training Center, or NTC, with Second Brigade Combat Team, First Cav. And I went as a social work intern, so I was working with their social work officer who was organic to them. But at the end of that rotation, they asked me if I wanted to be a convoy commander for the convoy from the box or the training site to where we had laundry facilities and food trucks and all of the things, showers, everything that people were looking forward to. And I don't know if I was asked that question as a joke or seriously, but I was like, heck yeah, I want to be your convoy commander. And I had no idea. I had no idea how to be a convoy commander, but I got with the command team and they taught me things, and I got to come to them as a humble medical officer who didn't know any better and just soak up all of the information. And that was the feedback that I received. And it may have been because we got to convoy to like the place everyone was looking forward to, but it was such a fun convoy. We had a vehicle go down. It didn't matter. We were going to get to our showers and our food trucks. We figured it out and we got there. That is an opportunity that I don't think I would have had otherwise. And if I went along with what may have been a joke and I laughed along, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. So that's one example. Another example would be this People First Center transformational leadership course that I've gotten an opportunity to work with for the last year. I get to work with company or troop level command teams across the installation on how to be more effective leaders. And so I have just loved that opportunity that no other behavioral health officer has been a part of. And it was just something that was offered to me. And I said yes. And so I love getting to hear these unique issues at company or troop levels, help them to work through those things, help them to develop their communication skills, help them to problem solve, help them to be more relational. And at the end, the feedback that we get is just that this is an experience that many leaders have never had in their entire military experience, the kind of training that they get and they get to work through in those few hours that we have them. So I think just going back to what Colonel Yarvis said, don't ever pass up an opportunity that's offered to you. Doesn't matter how big or small it might be, and it doesn't matter if it seems like it falls within your scope or not. Take it.
No, that's exceptional advice. And I appreciate you sharing one of your fun experiences to saying yes. I'm sure there was a lot of shock on their faces when you actually said yes. So I would have paid to see that one.
Maybe a little bit of worry too. Like, will we ever get there?
Yeah, never stay between combat arms and their showers.
That's right. That's right.
All right. So our last question is, tell us a fun fact about you. And if you don't know one, tell us your favorite ice cream.
Oh man, I don't. Well, okay. A fun fact about me, I don't have a combat patch because I've not actually deployed to a combat zone, though I do joke with those who have known me for a few years that I'm waiting for my COVID combat patch because I survived a serious bout of COVID a couple of years ago, and that may be the most combat that I see for a little while in the Army, but it's something that I think most people when they meet me or we get to talking don't expect. And so that's just a unique experience that I've had that's also shaped a little bit of my perspective over time.
Well, I don't know how fun that is. I mean, I know you're trying to paint it in the picture that it's fun because behind the scenes, I know how sick you actually got and how much of a struggle that was. So I think that actually speaks volumes for you and how you're hunting the good stuff. So nothing like giving us an example of some resiliency there. And if that's what you need, we'll get you that COVID patch. But Jamie, I really appreciate you delving into the work of a social worker, but also sharing a piece of your story because I think it's been an incredible journey. And for all the listeners out there, I recommend you go check out the 36 Engineer Brigade Facebook page just to see where Jamie continues to give to the community. You just established a program very similar to what you did when you were at 1st Med Brigade. You called it the Rugged Wish Program. The goal is to help 100 children with items that they need. Example, like jackets for the winter season. So Jamie Like, you're an incredible human being. You really embody selfless service. And so for you, I have a quote, and it's by Mother Teresa. It says, "We are not social workers. We are contemplatives in the heart of the world." And I think
I
that
love
really,
that.
well, it definitely, when I read it, it made me think of you. So I want you to know I appreciate what you're doing for our Army and our Medical Service Corps. And thank you very much for sharing a part of your story. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks so much, Colonel Moore. I hope you do as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Don't miss the next episode of the Be All You Can Be MSC podcast. Subscribe now and join our vibrant community of ambitious professionals who are taking their careers to the next level. The opinions shared on this podcast are the personal opinions of the guests and the hosts. They do not reflect the official position of the Medical Service Corps, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.